Hi everyone, and thank you for coming to watch this presentation, in which I'm going to be exploring how a dead language can still be useful to the living. Dead language is one which is no longer in spoken use, and is no longer the native language of any community, and ancient Egyptian is a good example of this, with its final stage, Coptic, having been out of common use for over 1,000 years. But does the fact that no one is using ancient Egyptian as their everyday language mean that it has no value or usefulness in the modern world? Over the next few minutes, I will be showing how ancient Egyptian can be used from a linguistics perspective to aid in the study of modern languages, in explaining their historical developments and predicting how they might develop in the future. In particular, I'll be focusing on a pattern called the linguistic cycle. This pattern shows a cycle within the development of a construction or language between forms that are more analytic and forms that are more synthetic. And analytic forms are those which contain more elements, which can also be separated by other things from outside the construction. For example, the English form, I am going to stop, is a very analytic form containing 5 different elements, which could mostly all have something like an adverb inserted between them. In contrast, synthetic forms are those which contain less elements, which are more interconnected and unable to be separated. For example, an ancient Greek equivalent of I am going to stop, palso, is quite synthetic, with 3 elements which are all quite short and which are completely inseparable. And you can even see just by looking at these next to each other that palso is a lot shorter than its English equivalent. So the linguistic cycle shows the alternation between the processes of analyticization, which makes the construction more analytic, and syntheticization, which makes the construction more synthetic. And each of these are macro processes, so they're actually caused by other linguistic processes. And I'll talk about the main ones of these that are involved in causing analyticization and syntheticization within this presentation. Egyptian has been noted to show a striking example of the linguistic cycle pattern, with this pattern being visible in the development of every single one of its verbal constructions, along with many of its other constructions, such as possession or indefinite and definite articles, among others. It also helps that Egyptian is the world's longest attested language, as this allows us to view the development of the linguistic cycle over a much longer time period than many other languages. Although the cycle does develop at different rates and different constructions, so there's no reason why it couldn't be visible in a language with a shorter history. So, to give an example of the linguistic cycle from an Egyptian verbal construction, here you can see the development of the negative present construction, and you can see that over time there's an increase in the number of elements, first with the addition of a verb ending, then an auxiliary, then a second negative marker and the element to, which appeared before first and second pronoun subjects. So while the earliest form of this construction contained 3 elements, the later form, ben, tui, her, sejam, una, contains 6. And these elements are mostly all independent words, with the exception of pronominal subjects for which suffixes were used. Then, after this form, we see a decrease in the number of elements involved, first through the loss of the auxiliary, and then through the loss of the pronominal marker to, so that the latest form contained 4 elements. And we also see these elements becoming less separable, with the negative marker, subject and verb going through coalescence, in which they became affixed together. So from all this, we see the forms of the negative present becoming more and more analytic, and then more and more synthetic, forming the linguistic cycle pattern. This development of this construction also shows the main causes of the creation of the linguistic cycle, which occurred in Egyptian verbal constructions. In the analyticization stage, we see the addition of an auxiliary into the construction, which also happens in the analyticization of all other Egyptian verbal constructions. And this addition also occurred at the exact same time in a change in word order from verb-subject to subject-verb in all but one construction, as we can see in the second and third forms of the negative present construction here. Then, for syntheticization, we see the processes of coalescence, which occurred in the syntheticization of every Egyptian verbal construction, erosion, which happened in all but 2 constructions, and which we can see here in the reduction of una to in, and loss, which occurred in the developments of 9 constructions. As well as these main processes involved in creating the linguistic cycle in Egyptian verbal constructions, the developments of these constructions also show that this pattern is not a true cycle, since the most synthetic forms in each synthetic stage are not equally synthetic. So, comparing en sejemef and nef sotum an in the negative present, we've already seen that the first of these has 3 elements, while the second has 4, and this shows that the later synthetic form is slightly less synthetic than the earlier one. So now we essentially have some things to look out for while looking at the linguistic cycle pattern in other languages. Although no other language shows quite such obvious and widespread examples of the linguistic cycle as Egyptian, there are several living languages for which it has been established that the linguistic cycle pattern is visible in the developments of certain constructions, and is even continuing to develop within the contemporary modern language. One of the most commonly discussed examples in studies of the linguistic cycle comes from the development of the future tense construction from Latin to modern-day French. Here we start with the Latin form amabo, a single word which was inseparable, which then became amare hebeo, 2 words which could be separated, which made this construction more analytic with the addition of hebeo as an auxiliary. This separability was lost in the development of the next form, amare, in which the auxiliary was eroded and 2 separate words experienced coalescence to form a single word, making the construction more synthetic again. It then saw another increase in analyticity with the addition of another means of expressing the subject, on top of the existing way of changing the form of the auxiliary ending. And this created the main form of the future tense, which is used in modern-day French. A further form is also in use in modern French, using a form of the verb aller as an auxiliary, in which the various elements are separable, and thus this form is yet more analytic. Several similarities can be noted between the development of the French future forms from their Latin origins and the developments of Egyptian verbal constructions. Firstly, it is clear that the main cause of this construction becoming more analytic was through the addition of an auxiliary, with the addition of hebeo in the first case of analyticization and ve in the second, each of which increased the length of the construction and made the elements within it more separable. We also see a change in word order from verb-subject to subject-verb, just like what happened in Egyptian verbal constructions. However, unlike in Egyptian constructions, this didn't occur just at the same time as the addition of an auxiliary, but was begun with the addition of a subject pronoun, which gave the word order subject, verb, subject in the form gemere, with all the forms before this having had verb, subject, word order. The change to subject, verb order is completed in the form je vais aimer. So the change in word order was completed at the same time as the addition of an auxiliary, which is similar to Egyptian, but we can see differences in the fact that it didn't begin with the addition of an auxiliary. And also there was no change in word order at all when the earlier auxiliary hebeo was added. We can also see that in its syntheticization, the Latin and French future construction experienced erosion in the reduction of hebeo to I at the end of the form, and coalescence, which made the elements of the construction inseparable in the form emere. And these processes are the same as the main causes of increases in syntheticity in Egyptian verbal constructions. And finally, within the developments of Egyptian verbal constructions, we can see that the linguistic cycle pattern is not truly cyclical, and we see the same in this development from Latin to French. For example, if we compare the 2 analytic forms, amare hebeo and je vais aimer, we see that the earlier of these contained 3 elements, while the later form contained 4, showing that the later form was more analytic. There are also other constructions in other languages which show the linguistic cycle pattern, which can be compared to the cycle in Egyptian verbal constructions. Although I don't have time to explore these in detail, you can see a couple of examples here. And firstly, we have the negative construction used in quiche, and this is used with multiple verbal constructions. So here the V just represents the place where the verb would go. And this construction shows similarities to the Egyptian negation used in the negative present construction, which we saw earlier went from using 1 negative marker to using 2. And we see the same in this construction. We also see the change from ma to mana, and the extension of elements is also seen in a few Egyptian constructions. And in both the quiche construction and the similar Egyptian negation, we see the partial loss of the original negative marker at the end of the development, with the original negative marker no longer being required to appear, but still being able to in some cases. So from these, we see the construction becoming more analytic first, and then more synthetic again. And then we have the Greek future construction, which shows similarities to Egyptian in that it became more analytic through the addition of an auxiliary, which happened at the same time as word order from verb subject to subject verb. And it became more synthetic through erosion and coalescence. The Greek future construction also shows the addition of a new element that wasn't an auxiliary, which also happened in some Egyptian verbal constructions, although not in all of them. However, the Greek future shows some differences in that it added more than one auxiliary, creating multiple forms which used auxiliaries, such as mello plus infinitive, echo plus infinitive, and thello plus infinitive. In contrast, Egyptian verbal constructions mostly only created one new form with an auxiliary throughout the development. The Greek future also shows a change in word order from subject-verb to verb-subject, reversing the earlier change from verb-subject to subject-verb. And this didn't happen in the development of any Egyptian verbal construction. So now just going back to the Latin and French construction, we can also use evidence from Egyptian verbal constructions to help predict the future developments of the French future construction. Although most Egyptian verbal constructions only show one full iteration of the linguistic cycle, going from synthetic to analytic to synthetic, some show further repetitions of either analyticization or syntheticization. And the past construction in particular shows two full repetitions of the linguistic cycle, with its development going synthetic, analytic, and synthetic again. This evidence that the linguistic cycle pattern did not stop just after one iteration, but kept going and repeating, would suggest that the French future construction will continue to keep following this pattern. So what we can predict is likely to happen is that je vais and me will become the main form of this construction, with j'aimerais dying out. And then je vais and me will begin to get more synthetic, likely through coalescence and erosion. The hypothetical form, je vais aimer, at the bottom here, was suggested as a possible development by Polgram, with the auxiliary and content verb having become inseparable through coalescence. However, evidence from Egyptian verbal constructions and from the earlier development of this Latin and French construction would suggest that this form would experience some erosion as well. As well as predicting the future of the ongoing full linguistic cycle patterns, evidence from Egyptian can also help predict the future developments in constructions which show partial cycles. For example, the development of the German past tense construction shows the analyticization stage of the linguistic cycle pattern, particularly in the spoken form, but increasingly in the written language as well. As in Egyptian verbal constructions, and the other verbal constructions that I've mentioned in this presentation, the increase in analyticity in the German past construction was primarily caused by the addition of an auxiliary. So this shows a strong similarity with the creation of the linguistic cycle pattern in other languages, meaning we can use these to help predict where the development of the German past construction might go next. So since in Egyptian verbal constructions, analyticization involves the more analytic form becoming the main form in the written language, we can suggest that the German analytic form, ich habe genommen, which is currently the main form used in the spoken language, will become the main form in the written language too. And it's already being used in informal written language in particular, so it's likely this will spread to more formal language as well. After this, it's likely this form will go through syntheticization, and evidence from Egyptian verbal constructions would suggest that this will happen primarily through the coalescence of two or more elements of this construction, making them inseparable, as well as the erosion of one or more elements, making them shorter. So to conclude, we can say that ancient Egyptian helps in establishing universal features of the linguistic cycle pattern. The main processes involved in creating the linguistic cycle in Egyptian are the addition of an auxiliary in verbal constructions, as well as coalescence and erosion. And we see all of these in constructions from other languages, showing that these are universally significantly involved in the creation of the linguistic cycle pattern. The development of Egyptian verbal constructions also show that the linguistic cycle pattern is not truly cyclical, with two synthetic stages in a construction not containing forms that are equally as synthetic, and the same for analytic stages. And this allows us to look out for this feature in other languages. And we can see from these constructions in other languages that the cycle is also not quite a true cycle there. So we can say that this is possibly a universal feature, although more constructions and languages would need to be considered to be sure. Egyptian also helps in predicting future developments in modern languages. The existence of an example of the linguistic cycle being repeated twice in the past construction in Egyptian shows that it's possible for this pattern to be repeated, making it likely that the French future will continue to develop in this way. First, with the more analytic form, je vais aimer, replacing j'aimerais as the main form of the construction, and then this form becoming more synthetic itself, likely through coalescence and erosion. Also, establishing the nature of the linguistic cycle in a language where it's very widespread helps spot partial linguistic cycles in other languages. For example, the ongoing development of the German past tense construction from a synthetic form to a more analytic one, caused by the addition of an auxiliary, shows great similarities to the analyticization stage of the linguistic cycle in Egyptian verbal constructions, which would suggest that once the form ich habe genommen becomes the main form in the written language as well as the spoken, it will then begin to become more synthetic itself, again, probably through coalescence and erosion. So overall, this shows that although ancient Egyptian is a dead language and is no longer useful to us as a means of communication, it still has use to us in helping understand the historical developments of the languages we currently use, as well as how they are likely to develop in the future. Thank you for watching.